Does it count down for you?
We're live now.
Yeah, I think we are live.
Perfect. Hello, everyone. I hope you can see and hear us now. It's our first time trying this new tool, but I assume we're live. And let's wait maybe for another minute for people to join from the waiting area, and then we can kick us off. Okay, everyone, let's get started. Welcome to our webinar on price elasticity. Good afternoon or good morning if you're joining from the US. I saw some people already that might be very early on right now. My name is Louise. I am Appinio's Global Research Director, and I'm joined today by my two wonderful expert leads, Svea and Vale, who are going to support us in this topic. Before we actually kick off the webinar, some mandatory housekeeping, I think, is in order because most of you likely won't be familiar with this webinar tool. So if you want to ask a question, the chat should be on the left-hand side labeled chat. I will do my best, and I see a lot of you are already using it. That's great. So I do my best to answer questions as we go. If I believe a question is relevant for the large audience, I will move it to the Q&A, and then we'll answer it for the whole group in the end. The tool also has a poll feature, which is also on the left-hand side. So to make this a bit more engaging, we will ask you questions in between because we sadly cannot interact with you directly. You're just names on our screens. So if there's a poll, it should pop up on the screen and also to your left. This is being recorded, and we will share the recording as well as the slides afterwards. So if you have to jump out earlier, you want to take a coffee break in between, no worries, you can still get the full content. I think that was it with the housekeeping. Please, any questions, just put them in the chat. I'll be here for you to take us through today's webinar. And then let's jump straight into the content. So we are going to talk about price elasticity, how we can price smarter in times of economic instability. Why are we talking about this topic? Well, as you can see, all of us are younger millennials. So our whole life has been this dog meme, constantly in a mode of crisis, pretending everything is fine. I mean, it started with COVID, then we went straight into hyperinflation after the Ukraine war. And just this year, Trump threatened every single country in the world with tariffs, and headlines like the ones on the screen happen on the daily. So there's a lot of economic uncertainty, a lot of price raises, and no one knows what's going to happen next week. As a result, consumer confidence has been really volatile and also dropping gradually over the years. We brought some exemplary data from the US and Germany. And as we can see, after 2020, so after the first COVID outbreak, consumer confidence really went down. It's very volatile and it's going down gradually. So for us as brands, this means we live with very worried consumers, very anxious consumers, in very uncertain times. And also we often worry about price increases because our suppliers also keep charging us more, forcing us sometimes to raise prices for our products and our services. And then we as brands might worry, okay, but what will happen? Like, what will happen if we have to increase prices? Will we lose consumers? Do we have to keep the price stable but shrink pack size instead? So it is also for us as brand managers, as marketing managers, as product managers, a very difficult world right now. And as the great Laura McNally said, our best defense in uncertain times is level-headed, data-driven decisions. However, in order for that advice to work, we need data first, and we need valid data, reliable data, data that we can really trust. And as most of you likely know, especially when it comes to pricing, price increases, and willingness to pay, asking consumers directly is really difficult because human decision making is very, very irrational. People don't really have access to their decision making processes. and they often overclaim what they're willing to spend. So if we want to look into a topic like this, we really need some deep methods and some really good KPIs to look at. And one of them is price elasticity. And because it's such a complex topic, I brought my expert leads to guide us through the subject matter. So Svea, can you please kick us off and explain what price elasticity actually is?
Yes, thank you, Luisa, and hello, everyone. I'm happy to do so because we actually chose to talk about price elasticity today because we feel that it's kind of an overlooked KPI when it comes to navigating through difficult economic times, but also in marketing and pricing research in general. But before we dive into the topic, we would really love to understand your general knowledge base on price elasticity. So we created this super quick poll. It's literally one question. How would you rate your knowledge on price elasticity of demand? And the answer options are, wait, it's elasticity, not a yoga term. Heard of it, not sure what it is. I've got the basics down, and honestly, I could run this webinar. And we already see answers coming in, tendency towards the basics. Let's wait a couple of seconds. Okay. I think it's quite clear you all know about the basics, which is good. I think we have something for all knowledge bases today. For those of you who feel not as familiar, think it's a yoga term, let's start at the beginning. What is price elasticity actually? I'm a visual learner, so I brought this little chart here where you can see the price on the vertical axis and the quantity demanded on the horizontal axis. And then this little blue line is the price demand curve, which reflects the relationship between price and demand. Now I can select any price, let's call it P1, and I can see how many people would buy at that specific price. Now I want to learn what would happen if I change the price. For example, if I increase it from P1 to P2, and I can see that the quantity and demanded goes down, which is of course a very classic reaction in most markets. If you increase prices, demand will go down. But the question is, how much does demand change in reaction to price changes? And this is really what price elasticity is all about. So it tells us how sensitive our consumers are towards price changes. And it is reflected in the super simple formula: is the percentage change in quantity demanded divided by the percentage change in price. And depending on people's sensitivity and the outcome of this, we speak of elastic versus inelastic demand. Elastic demand looks somehow like this. This is when changes in prices lead to a disproportional impact on the demand. So we can see here, if we increase the price, we see a huge drop in demand. This is something that we usually see for products like consumer electronics or vacation packagings. So things where people have a lot of choice, and if prices go up, they usually just look for better options. And it's reflected by a rather steep curve, price demand curve, and price elasticity values of larger than 1. Now, if we talk about inelastic demand, that means that people only show very little reaction to price changes. So you can see the curve is much steeper. We have values lower than 1, and this is something that we typically see for essential products like electricity or gasoline or prescription medicine, where people don't really have an option. If prices go up, they are kind of forced to buy it. And the nice thing about price elasticity, or the advantage of knowing about your price elasticity, is that you can make pretty good predictions what would happen to your revenue if you change the price. So let's look at that for elastic demand first. So we learned that with elastic demand, people react strongly to price changes. So if I increase the price just a bit, this will lead to a disproportional drop in demand, and much more so than the additional revenue that I gain per unit. So my total revenue will go down. On the other hand, if I lower the price a bit, then the additional demand that I generate is more than able to compensate for the loss in price. So my total revenue will go up. That is very theoretical. So let's look at another chart. So we can see here our P1 and PQ, which is resulting in our revenue 1 marked in this green box. Now we increase the price to P2, and we can see that our quantity drops significantly, and this purple new revenue box already looks smaller, but this should make it more clear. So we can see that the loss area in green from our lower demand is much bigger than the gain area here in purple from our higher price. So as a rule of thumb for elastic demand, you can say that price and total revenue always move in opposite directions. If you increase the price, total revenue will go down. If you lower the price, total revenue will go up. So if you are in a market with rather elastic demand, pricing discounts, for example, can be quite helpful in pushing volume, whereas price increases can quickly backfire. Now, with inelastic demand, we learned that people don't react very strongly to price changes. So if we increase the price a bit, then we only use a few customers. So the actual revenue gain per unit is much higher than the loss in sales. So our total revenue will increase. On the other hand, if we lower the prices, then the few additional people that we reach cannot make up for the loss from the lower price, so our total revenue goes down. Again, let's look at a chart. We can see P1 and Q1. Now we change the price to P2, and we see there's only little reaction in the quantity demanded. Revenue 2 looks quite big, but we can see it here. In this case, the loss from our smaller demand is much smaller than the gain from our higher price. So for inelastic demand, price and total revenue always move in the same direction. If you increase price, your total revenue will go up. If you lower the price, your total revenue will go down. Yeah, Luisa, so far.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we have a really good understanding now of what elastic and inelastic actually means. I'm a bit sad it's not a yoga term, but they're really exciting. However, listening to you, I'm now a little bit worried that the demand for a product only depends on price, because that would be very sad news for brands around the globe. Is that actually the case?
No, that's the short and simple answer. Don't be scared. You can actually have a high impact on people's sensitivity towards prices by investing in your brand, because strong brands have much more levers to increase prices without having to fear a huge drop in sales. And maybe we can look at a practical example from the electronics sector. We have Xiaomi, I never know how to pronounce it, which is a Chinese electronics provider with rather little popularity and a low customer base or loyal customer base. And we can see that their price demand curve looks quite steep. Please note that now actually the axes are switched. So now we have price on the horizontal axis to make it a bit more challenging for all of you. And now if Xiaomi decides to increase their prices, a lot of people will look for better option because the emotional attachment is very low. On the other hand, we have a brand like Apple. which is of course highly popular, has a huge loyal customer base. And here the curve looks visibly flatter. So if Apple decides to increase their prices a bit, which they often do, then a lot of people would still continue buying their products because they just like the status maybe of the brand, they are loyal to it, maybe they're also kind of stuck in the whole ecosystem of Apple products. So a brand like Apple just has a lot more flexibility when it comes to price increases in order to increase profits. And maybe to look at another real-world example from a brand that should make it really clear how investing in your brand's strength, but also focusing on price elasticity as a core KPI can really build a huge success story. I actually stole this one from you, Louise, from your OMR masterclass because I liked it so much. It's about the brand McCain. I only see black box. That's not supposed to be like that. I don't know why. So yeah, it's McCain. It's a Canadian brand for frozen products, mainly fries, as you can see. And in order to highlight their success story, we need to go back to the year 2014, where McCain was faced with some huge problems. The first one being that discounters like Aldi were gaining more and more market share, but McCain wasn't even listed there. So for an ever-growing segment of value-focused customers, McCain wasn't even physically available. In addition to that, half the market was now buying private label products. So for McCain, it was really difficult to fit in there and claim a premium price and deliver arguments for that. So their answer was putting out one discount campaign and price promotion after the other, but that wasn't really sustainable because it really squeezed their margins and profits. So McCain was faced with two options. They could either continue with their aggressive price promotion, hoping that volume would go up, but apparently they had some very smart analysts on their team who decided to look at McCain's price elasticity scores, and they figured out that it was actually one. So it was unit elastic, which means that the demand was changing in the exact same ratio as the price. So if you lower the price, it doesn't really have an impact on the revenue, it leaves it untouched, but it could lead to increased variable costs. So not really a fruitful strategy. And the other option would be to rather go with a long-term investment in their plan because they realize, aha, if I am able to lower my price elasticity, then I can profit from that. For example, they made some predictions. If they were able to lower it from 1 to 0.5, then a 10% price increase would lead to a 77% increase on profit, which is, of course, insane. And they decided to go with this way. So over the next 9 years, they highly invested in their brand. How exactly they did that is really food for another webinar, but the German-speaking audience can also look Louise's OMR masterclass. In the end, it all paid out. Let's look at some numbers. So McCain was able to lower price elasticity scores from 1 to 0.57. They were hence able to increase their price per kilo by 48%. This meant that they were able to increase their base sales, so the sales of non-discounted products, by 44%, and their gross profits by 32%, which is super impressive, Louise, right?
I love this McCain case. I already put it in the chat. I know this is not a branding masterclass, but I can only recommend reading it. And we're already getting first questions that direction. How would we actually approach this? So what if I'm a brand, I'm inspired by this McCain example, and I want to understand my price elasticity and then work on it. What can I actually do? Like, what tools do I have? What steps can I take? Can you shed some light on this?
Yeah, good question. I mean, in an ideal world, we would, of course, use actual sales data, but we learned that, or we have the feeling that a lot of our clients don't necessarily have them. And also, sometimes you want to have the data before you make a decision that could lead to a disaster. So market research is your friend. And as you mentioned in the beginning, especially when it comes to pricing research, things get really complicated. So you want to rely on more advanced, established methods. And I will quickly guide you through the most popular ones. First, we have the Van Destendorp method, which is a procedure which measures people's sensitivity towards prices by means of 4 open-ended questions. So you ask them at what price would they think a product is too expensive, so that people wouldn't consider buying it. At what price would it be expensive that you would consider buying it? At what price is it cheap or a good deal? And at what price is it too cheap so that you would doubt the quality? Then we have the Gabor-Granger, which works with closed questions and fixed price points, where you ask people's likelihood to buy at certain price points. And then we have the conjoint, which is the most advanced, but also the most complex and cost-worthy one, which makes real-world simulations of trade-offs that people make between different attribute combinations, and also measures their willingness to pay. And one thing that they all have in common is that they allow to generate a price demand curve, which we learned is kind of the basic for calculating price elasticity. Let's quickly look at that. So the Van Destendorp itself is actually not able to create that, but there's something called the Newton-Miller-Smith extension, which is basically adding 2 scaled questions for the acceptably cheap and acceptably expensive price. And then you can plot a price demand curve, which is quite detailed, as you can see in this example. For the Gabor-Granger, you go into a negotiation with the respondents. So you present them a price, you ask about the willingness to buy at that price, and depending on their answer, you show a higher or lower price, and then you get this very sleek curve with 6 to 8 price points usually. And then again, for the conjoint, you show the respondent different products and have them decide between it. And then you can also plot the price demand curve, and you can oftentimes also do it in comparison to your competitors, which can give additional insights.
Thank you.
So far from the theory.
Thanks a lot. Understood that we have 3 major tools in our toolbox. However, to me, it's still not really clear how we can get from survey data to the demand curves and the price elasticity values that you were showing in the beginning in theory. So, Vale, can you go even one step deeper and explain how do I get from my Van Destendorp output and my Gabor-Granger output to this curve and my price points?
Absolutely. I'm going to take care of that. And actually, myself, I'm one of those people who needs to see the theory put in practice before I actually fully understand the theory. And that's exactly what we're going to do now. So this graph that you can see here, it's very similar to the one that Svea was showing before. So we've got our price on the horizontal axis and our demand on the vertical axis. And as you can see, we're having a starting point of 149 with a demand, a purchase intention of 100%. And as soon as we increase the price to 199, the demand goes down to 98. When we increase the price further to 249, the demand goes down to 85, and so on until we reach the most expensive price of 399 and the lowest demand of 28%. So through our research, through our studies, through the methodologies that Svea was outlining before, we're able to identify all these points. So what is the demand that corresponds to my price? So we plot this chart. We've got our points. And now you must be like, okay, let's think back about the definition that Svea was saying. How can we calculate price elasticity? And if you remember, it's no other than the change in quantity demanded over the change in price, both in percentages. we're going to now see the exact calculations. If you're not into math, into numbers, you can dissociate yourself for the next 2 minutes, and then we're going to come back to something a bit more interesting. But we're going to see some number, right? So as you can see in the second step, the step 2, we've got 2 different points, one in orange and one in green. We've got a starting price and a starting demand, and then a second price and a second demand. And we want to get to the quantity demanded over the change in quantity demanded over the change in price. So we have our 2 points again. The starting price was 199 and the starting demand was 19%. The second price was 249 and the second demand was 85%. So we go back to our denominator, which was the percentage change in demand. And what we do is that we take our second demand, which was 85, and we take 98 out of it. So the second demand less the first demand. Now, let's take a step back. Because we don't know exactly what the function is behind our curve, we need to use what is called the midpoint method. So we simply divide this division by the midpoint, which is 85 plus 98 divided by 2. It's nothing that you need to know. We're always going to take care of the math, but it's just some extra info as to why we're dividing everything by the midpoint. So we calculate the change in demand, which is minus 14.2%, which was the denominator of in our calculation, in our equation. And then we also have the denominator of our fraction, which is the percentage change in price. So we take 249, the second price, minus the first price, which was 199. And again, we divide it by the midpoint because of the same reasoning, the same logic we applied before. And we get the percentage change in price, which is 22.3%. So now all we have to do is just take the percentage change in demand and divide it by the percentage change in price. So we've got minus 14.2% divided by 22.3%. And finally, we get to our elasticity, minus 0.64. But now that you're here, you're like, okay, what do I do with this number? How can I read it? What does that mean? And if you remember, Svea was already saying that before, but we can use our little, let's say, cheat sheet that we find in the next slide. And the simple thing that you have to do is that you take the value that you just calculated. In our case, it was minus 0.64. And if this number, in this case, you just want to take the absolute value, so 0.64, if this number is lower than 1, it means that our demand is inelastic. It means that we have a change in price that results in a weaker change in quantity. So the move that we do horizontally in price is greater than the move that we do vertically in demand. So in terms of strategy, what it means is that we can afford to increase prices because as a consequence, we're also going to increase revenue. We're not going to experience huge drops in demand. Then we've got what is called unitary elastic demand. And this is exactly what Svea was also outlining before with the McCann case. And this is what happens when we've got the exact change in price, which results in an exact change in demand. So in this case, what you want to do as a company really depends on your production capabilities. You can either decide to increase or decrease the prices, knowing that this all is going to have a consequence on your production. And then finally, when our value is above 1, is greater than 1, it means that we're going to have a change in price that will correspond in a bigger change in quantity demanded. So in this case, what will happen when we have an elastic demand is that if we increase prices, demand will drop and we will be experiencing losses in revenue, which is what we don't want to have. And so in this case, the typical strategy is that we decrease price to increase revenues. Something that I want to say, a little digression, is that we saw before in the previous slide with our calculation that we got to a negative value, minus 0.64. And this is almost always the case. Elasticity is almost always negative because usually when we increase price, usually demand drops, our purchase intention will drop. There are a few exceptions, for instance, when we're talking about luxury goods or speculative products, such as, for instance, housing, that might experience a positive demand. So you can think, for instance, when the house prices rise, people are going to think that prices will increase even further in the future, so people will start buying. And this is one of the cases in which we can find a positive elasticity. But again, this is very rare. Usually elasticity is very often, almost always negative. So
the math was actually less daunting than I expected. So thank you for taking us through it. However, what's still not really clear to me is when I would choose each of the three methods. Like, when would I actually splurge on a conjoint, or I think, as Clara put it in the chat already, without having to go like full crazy, full volumetric, when can I do Van Westendorp? Can you give us some guidelines?
Yes, we actually prepared a slide on this topic. Again, we're going to share the deck later so you can really look through the table, see if you find your use case. But something that we mentioned before is that the conjoint is the method that truly is able to answer the majority of your pricing research question. As you can see here from the heat map, you'll see that a lot of green is in the conjoint column. And there's always a little red, which, yeah, exactly. I think it was covered by my face. You can see here that the red is on the last line, used for quick, low-cost pricing study. So although the conjoint is an amazing method that can really answer a lot of questions, it is also the most complex, most expensive, and the most lengthy one in terms of delivering of the results. So it really depends the type of objective you have. If you think it's going to be a quick, easy research question that you have, perhaps we might go to a Van Westendorp or a Gabor Granger, as opposed to having a very full, complete analysis, which might be delivered by the conjoint. So if you have any use case in mind, you can refer to this chart that we're going to share, to this slide that we're going to share later, or you can always come to us so we can guide you towards the right method. But yeah, so long story short, usually the conjoint is the best, tends to be the best, but it's also the most expensive. So we can also use Gabor Granger and Van Westendorp, which should also give us very good results in a faster and more efficient way.
Thank you, Vale. I think this decision-making table is really, really helpful, because actually the three of us had a very similar discussion or decision-making process earlier this year when Trump dropped the tariff talks in April. We really wanted to do some research because we knew that multiple categories across the globe would be affected by price increases. And we wanted to understand, okay, what does that mean for like wine from France, olive oil from Spain, or just other consumer goods like t-shirts and jeans. And we had this like very unique use case of measuring price elasticity for a full category and not for a specific brand or product. And in this case, we actually decided on the Van Westendorp, because there the conjoint would have not really worked. So for some use cases, it has the biggest strength. And although the tariff talk is currently tabled, who knows? I think it still makes sense to look at some data. And we already get some questions in the chat to see more FMCG examples. And while, if I'm not mistaken, you've brought us to FMCG examples from this April study. So can you please guide us through these results?
100%. So yeah, just to give you some more background on the study that we're going to present. As Louise was anticipating, when Trump starting to talk about tariffs, we all as Europeans started to think about how this would affect our daily life, all the different categories that we used to buying on the daily. And we had so many categories in mind, but we decided to restrain ourselves, have some self-control, and we only tested 19 out of all the ones we had in mind, those that we thought were the most interesting and the more diverse, to cover as many aspects as possible. And the study that we launched specifically was split into two parts. One of them was more descriptive, that covered more and wanted to explore more the usage, attitude, behaviors of consumers, and also worries about the future. And then the second part was focusing more on pricing. And specifically, as also Louise was mentioning, we used the Van Westendorp price sensitivity meter in conjoint with the Newton-Miller-Smith extension. So thanks to these two methods, we were able to identify the accepted price range, the optimal price, as well as the price elasticities. So a very complete study for these 19 categories. And just so you know, we did not torture the respondents. We did not ask them to evaluate the 19 categories. Each of them only had to assess 3 based on the ones they consumed. Overall, we gathered over 2,000 answers. The study was launched in the US, 2 people aged between 16 and 99 years old. And before we jump into our results, I actually wanted to ask you a little question. We have a little poll for you. And so with the knowledge that we gain on price elasticity, knowing that some categories can be more elastic than other, meaning that demand might drop faster than other when prices are rising, we wanted to ask you, what do you think is more elastic? A pack of ground coffee or a bar of chocolate? So you want to think which category is most likely to experience the highest drop in demand when the prices are rising. A pack of ground coffee that you can buy at the supermarket or a bar of chocolate. It's quite difficult, I know, because it also heavily depends on your consumption habits, and I'm gonna explain why in a sec once the poll is closed. So far, it seems like the bar of chocolate is winning. However, and I'm already spoiling the results by saying, however, coffee is actually the more price elastic. So the table that you can see here presents the 19 category that we assessed, that we analyzed. You got the accepted price range, the optimal price range, and then the fourth column represent the price elasticity for the whole category. And the way you can read this table, especially the heat map, the colored column, is that a 10% increase in price would result in 20% drop in demand for coffee, 19.6 drop in demand for orange juice, 17.9 for cheese. So they already ranked from most elastic to least elastic. And I also remember that when I saw the results for the first time, I was a bit surprised because I was expecting also coffee to be more inelastic, but I think it was also my personal bias because I'm a bit addicted to coffee. So for me, it's rather inelastic. But then I started to think about the results a bit more, and I was like, okay, here we're talking about a pack of ground coffee that you could buy at the supermarket or at your coffee store. And I started thinking, wait, if I think about myself, if prices had to raise, probably I just gonna reduce the amount of times that I do my coffee at home. As a consequence, the amount of coffee I buy at the supermarket. I'm just gonna rather have a coffee on the go while I'm outside, start drinking coffee at work because it's for free, as opposed to other categories such as wine and chocolate, which are, as you can see, rather inelastic. Because when I'm thinking about wine and chocolate, these are categories that I'm like, oh, I'm gonna buy when I wanna treat myself, when I wanna spoil myself. And in this situation, when I'm buying these categories, I really don't mind spending $1-2 more because it's something that I buy to treat myself, as opposed to coffee, which is something that I buy, let's say, to survive. I've got more alternatives, and I don't really need to splurge so much on it, at least for the majority of us. Happy to also brainstorm on the interpretation of this at a later stage, but these are the results, this is the ranking, and now we're gonna deep dive even further into analyzing these results. Specifically, we're going to look at coffee first. Thanks to the Newton-Miller-Smith extension, we're able to plot this curve. Again, just a reminder that the horizontal axis is price, the vertical axis is demand. And you can see we've got quite an irregular curve. This is totally normal. And I must say that the line, the curve as we see it as of now, it doesn't really tell us much. It is very, let's say, informative if you know exactly how to read, if you know all the context. But I'm gonna guide you through the results in the next slide, because not only were able to plot this curve, but thanks to the Van Westendorp analysis, we were able to identify, first of all, the accepted price range. In this case, for a pack of 12 ounces of non-organic coffee, we were able to identify the accepted price range is between $4.50 to $6.99. So in this case, it means that if we want people to deem our price as acceptable, we need to stay within this range. If we go cheaper, people are going to start doubting the quality and they're not going to buy. If we go above the $6.99, people are going to think it's too expensive and they're not going to buy our product. So we really need to be within this range. We also then identified the optimal price range, which is $5, which is the price that is going to maximize and stabilize our revenue. And all this data is something that we were able to gather from the Van Westendorp analysis. Then, thanks to the Newton-Miller-Smith extension, we're able to calculate the demand for each one of the different prices, as well as their price elasticities. So as you can see, each different price has a different price elasticity, and this is also why the curve is not linear. I think somebody was mentioning that in the comments before, that we almost never see a very linear elasticity curve when it comes to this sort of chart, price with demand. But indeed, each price point has a different demand and has different price elasticity. And something that I think is super interesting here is that, well, first of all, it's very useful to know at which price elasticity I'm operating when I'm pricing my product. But it's also important to see if there's any red flag, any price that might cause a sudden drop in demand. And this is what we call the psychological price cliff. As you can see here, for coffee, we can see two price cliffs. If you can see in the table, those are marked in red. So at 550, we've got a demand of 40% and a price elasticity of 4.05. And then we also see another cliff at 650. I think it's not by chance that we see this drop at the 50 mark. It's probably something psychological, that when people start seeing the price point 50, something gets triggered in their brain and they start thinking, oh wait, this is a bit too expensive for me. I'm going to reduce my consumption. I'm going to stop buying. And for me, this represents a threshold in my mind that is going to make me switch brand, is going to make me switch product, and it's going to make me buy less. And as a consequence, there's a sudden drop in demand. And these are what we call psychological price cliffs. In the graph here, you can see one right after the optimal price of $5. There's a drop there, and that's a psychological price cliff. So it's really useful to understand what is the demand behind each price and what is the price elasticity behind each price, so we can understand how we can move. Is it really worth to increase the price by only 25 cents, knowing that I'm going to cause a huge drop in demand? And we also see that there's a lot of variety, right? And also this really represents psychological barriers in the mind of the consumers, and these vary category by category. Because for instance, when we move from 450 to 475, there is no cliff. When we move from 6 to 625, there is no cliff. However, there are some cliffs from 525 to 550, and then from 625 to 650. So really, those are really triggers that are going to raise a red flag in the mind of the consumer that's going to make them go, wait, this is a bit expensive. I'm going to buy less, or I'm not going to buy. So really need to be aware of what's going on within pricing, not only in a specific price point, but also in the prices that are close to what we have. And also something that I wanted to mention. So you saw in the graph, in the table before, they were ranking all of our categories, right? And the way we did that is that once we calculated all the price elasticities and all the demanded, we used two different methods. One is the average elasticity within the accepted price range, and the second one is the log-log regression. If you didn't understand what I was just saying in the last two sentences, just know that we calculated the overall price elasticity for the whole category, in this case for coffee, and the both tests that we ran, the average and the log-log regression, they gave elasticities above 1, meaning that the category is actually an elastic one. And what we can learn from this analysis, so if I was the CMO for a coffee company, I would learn that I really need to avoid price hikes above 525 and 625, because once I start moving from there, I'm very likely to experience those psychological cliffs, those sudden drops in demand, which of course I want to avoid because I don't want huge losses in revenue. I also understood what an optimal price point is for my category. So I really want to anchor the price around that optimal price, which in our case for coffee, it was $5. I also learned that the accepted price range is not that big. It only goes from 450 to 699. So whenever I want to make pricing decision, I cannot make huge jumps from like 450 to 550 or even more. I really need to be wary, and I need to make sure that my price increase are rather small, minimal, because I don't want to incur in big drops in demand. And then in case I'm really faced with the decision that I have to go towards those cliffs, I can know that I can use some promotions, some communication strategies to try and offset those damages caused by the demand cliffs. Now that we've learned what we did for coffee, we're going to look at the same analysis, but for wine. And if you remember, coffee was one of those more elastic product categories, as opposed to wine, which is one of the least elastic. Again, we were able, thanks to the Newton-Miller-Smith extension, to plot our curve. Again, very irregular. There's some bumps, there's some cliffs in here as well. And more specifically, thanks to the Van Westendorp and Newton-Miller-Smith analysis, we learned that for wine, the accepted price range is actually quite wide. It goes between $10 and $18. The optimal price point is $12, meaning that this is the price that is going to maximize my revenue. And we also learned that there are two cliffs, one at $11 and one at $16. And I think, again, it's quite curious. If you remember, for coffee, we saw it at $5.50 and $6.50. And now here we see it at $11 and 16. And I remember that at the time we were launching this study, I was in parallel reading another article on wine that was saying that those more rounded prices like 10, 15, 20 actually represent thresholds for the consumer. So maybe if I'm buying a wine that's below 10, I'm thinking that I'm buying something that is a bit more of an everyday wine. If I buy between 10 and 15, it might be something that I consider more everyday premium. If I go above 15, it might be more premium. And this was actually corroborated by this research, because we see that as soon as we move from 10 to 11, we experience a cliff. As soon as we go from 15 to 16, we start experiencing this cliff again. So it's really interesting to see that, for wine, those rounded numbers such as 10 or 15 really represent the thresholds, the limits that we can set in our mind when we want to purchase wine. So, okay, my limit might be 10. So when I start moving towards 11, then my inclination to buy might decrease significantly. So what we can see here is that, again, we've got these two cliffs that we really need to stay away from. And exactly as we did for coffee, we also run two different types of tests to calculate the overall elasticity for the category. We've got the average elasticity within the accepted range, which gave 0.92, and then the log-log regression, again, a logarithm regression that we run across all the elasticities, and that also gave 0.96. So both of them are below 1. And if you remember our table before, this also means that the demand for wine is rather inelastic. So we can draw similar conclusion as the ones we draw for coffee. So if I was the CMO of a wine company, again, I would be very aware of those psychological cliffs. I would be very careful if I'm staying very close to the $10 and $15 marks, because as soon as I start moving and increases pricing from there, I might be experiencing huge drops in demand. I also learned again what my optimal price point is, being $12. So if I want to stabilize my demand, if I want to maximize my revenue, I am better off staying around this $12. In this case, we see that the range of the accepted price is quite wider, right? For coffee, it was only between $4.50 to $6.99, and now we see that it's between 10 and 18. So here we've got more margin, especially when we're moving away from those cliffs, to increase prices by even $2 to $3. And then I think that also based on other studies that were run on wine, we can really make a lot of consideration when it comes to the target group and brand image implication. This is especially relevant if you're entering the market, or if you're exploring the market, if you want to enter it, that the price that we give to our wine can really have an impact on the type of target group that I'm attracted and the brand image that I might be portraying around my brand. So I might be positioning myself more as a everyday wine, a premium everyday wine, or a premium wine. So again, knowing that there are these psychological cliffs, meaning that there's brand image consideration attached, having this full comprehensive understanding of the pricing for my category is really important, so I can avoid having huge losses and I can make sure that I can maximize my revenue.
Thank you, Vale. That was super, super interesting. I love these psychological price cliffs, because I think they just show that consumers are not rational, that we have these anchors in our brains, that we might buy a $10 bottle of wine for myself, but a $15 bottle of wine if I'm giving you a gift. And this is actually my decision-making criteria. Sadly, I assume most of us are not vineyard owners or CMOs of wine companies. So what would you say are like core takeaways from the last 45 minutes? So if our lovely audience forgot all of the crazy math that we did, that's okay. But what should they actually remember? Svea, I think you're on
mute. Talking to myself. Okay. So one thing that we hopefully were able to emphasize is that it really is worth looking at price elasticity as a core metric, and then based on it, set smart and segment-specific price strategies. So if you are in a market where you are handling products with rather inelastic demand, then you can make small price increases, because they will only have a minimal impact on volume, so it can help you offset rising costs or margin pressures. If you are in a market with elastic products, which is, I guess, the majority, especially for our FMCG clients, then you can consider levels like promotion, smaller pack sizes, or value bundles in order to keep price-sensitive shoppers engaged without sacrificing profitability.
Right, then I'm here again talking about psychological price cliffs. As we saw in the later part of the presentation, we can see that there exist thresholds where even a small increase in price can cause a sharp decline in sales in demand. So what we want to be aware of is that they exist. We want to know at which price we can identify those psychological price cliff so we can stay away from them. And in this way, we can maintain customer loyalty, a steady revenue, and these are important even in those more stable and, let's say, less volatile markets. So it's always important to know where these cliffs happen so we can make sure to avoid them. I think we're clicking at the same time. And I think you're muted again.
I'm sorry, guys, not my day today with the technique. So I think one thing that we learned from the McCain case is that it's really worth investing in your brand in order to lower people's sensitivity towards prices. But in order to do so, you need, of course, to understand what actually impacts people's willingness to pay. And for that, you can use advanced multivariate analysis tool like key driver analysis or conjoint analysis, which helps you to measure which product, brand, or even personality specific aspects relate to factors that drive consumers' willingness to pay in order to then be able to address this and lower their price sensitivity.
Yes, and last but not least, I feel like a lot of times we're analyzing elasticities and making pricing consideration in a very isolated way, when truly it can also represent a KPI for my brand health and for my marketing effectiveness. If you think about it, one of the goals for my brand would be that I'm able to increase prices without really experiences losses in demand. I want my consumer, my customers, to really see the value in my offering so that even when I increase pricing, they still see that value and they're still willing to buy. So truly, when we're launching, developing campaigns, in addition to all the more traditional KPIs, such as awareness, consideration, mental availability, mental market share, mental penetration, we can also think of pricing and elasticity as one of our brand KPIs, because over time, we want to make sure that our elasticity or our demand is becoming increasingly inelastic so that I can afford to increase my prices without losing profit, without losing revenue. So in addition to, again, all my more traditional KPIs for campaigns and brand health, we want to add elasticity on top of this so I can track how inelastic or how elastic my demand becomes over time. So not only a one-off analysis, but rather a tracking one over time. I want to make sure that I'm improving in my elasticity, making the demand for my product more and more inelastic over time. And we've now reached the end of all our theoretical explanation and showcasing of our results, which of course you'll also be able to access later, both the presentation but also the study itself, if you're also curious about the more descriptive part, the usage questions, behavioral questions. So as of now, thank you so much for your attention. And it's not over yet because we do have some time, I think a bit more than 5 minutes. But we can stay longer if needed.
We got a lot of great questions already in the chat, and I've been trying to answer them as we go, and some of them you ladies also answered throughout the webinar. However, there was one question from Clara, which I found really interesting, because she was asking if there's a way to correct the measures that we're making for innovation, for example, to take into account the brand market share, just like a brand health KPI, and for existing products to take into account the actual sales or a weighted distribution And I think this is a very interesting question. And Svea made me think a bit of brand price trade-off, conjoint, but I might be completely off. You're the expert. So what do you think about Clara's suggestions?
Yeah, completely agree, Clara. I think your suggestion make a lot of sense. And actually, if we try to somehow measure that in market research, we would, as Luisa mentioned, use methods like brand-specific conjoint or brand price trade-off analysis to also simulate these factors. And maybe some things that could be added here, and this is something that the methods do, is to include the competitive landscape, because of course this can also influence elasticity. Also, maybe you can look into promotional history. So if you like Becane had a past with very like heavy promotions, this also of course somehow impacts your price elasticity. And also there are of course seasonal effects and trends that could also be regarded when weighing or making the predictions more realistic.
Thank you, Svea. If there's any other questions, please put them in the chat so we can answer them. As I said in the beginning, we will share the recording with you, including this deck, so you don't have to remember anything. You can refer back to the slides, plus some reading recommendations outside of the McCain case, which, if you ask me, is really a must-read recommendation. But as always, if you have questions, if you want to understand price elasticity for your products, if you're struggling with Excel and the math, please always just reach out to your Appinio person or just to Svea, Valle, and me directly. We are really happy to help. And since I don't see more questions incoming, I can only leave to thank both Svea and Valle for sharing their wisdom and their knowledge, and for sharing all of you for joining this very complicated, maybe a bit nerdy topic and discuss price elasticity with us, for asking all of the questions. And I wish you a wonderful rest of your day and hopefully see you in the next webinar.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.